If you've ever looked at your own pet portrait that you made and thought, something's just missing, then this video is for you. Today, I am going to be painting my own dog, Cora, who is just the silliest little corg on the planet. And I'm going to be sharing 5 habits that honestly have completely changed how I approach painting pet portraits and realistic wildlife in general. These are the things that I wish I started doing years ago because they've helped me to paint faster, more confidently, and actually capture the personality of the animal that I paint. So, whether you're painting a dog, commission, or wildlife art, these will help. Let's jump in. If you want to learn how to paint realistic wildlife and pets faster and more easily, that's exactly what I teach inside the Wildlife Painting Academy. Each month, you'll get new step-by-step tutorials that'll walk you through every brushstroke, plus reference photos, paint mixes, and all that good stuff to make the whole process super simple. If this sounds interesting to you, you can check it out in the link below. The first habit that I started doing was to treat my underpainting like a roadmap, not a masterpiece. And I guess just to take one step back to actually do an underpainting. So this one helped me to work faster and loosen up, which is 2 things that I really struggled with early on. So basically, my earlier paintings, they would take forever. Basically, because I was going in and painting every single brushstroke like it was the final layer. And the thing is that I ended up having to cover up a lot of my hard work along the way because ultimately I was detailing before I was ready, and it was creating a really weak painting. But once I started to realize that the underpainting, it's your base, it's your foundation, and then everything else goes on top of that solid foundation, everything changed. So in this portrait, I started with a really great underpainting. So I'm focusing on building up my 3D form of my pup here with values. So going in with some really dark darks, building up those middle tones, and then adding those highlights, blocking in that fur, and then kind of having a vague idea of where the direction of the fur is going. But ultimately, I'm focusing on building up the 3D shape of this dog here with values and just focusing on basic shapes. I'm not stressing, things aren't looking too perfect. I'm definitely not stressing about perfect color matching right now. Just building that strong underpainting. And the thing is that once I started to let myself work a little more loose in the underpainting and actually start doing an underpainting to begin with, then I found that the detail stage just went so much better. I had so much more freedom with it. It felt so much easier. It looked better. Basically, everything was just starting to come together with so much more ease. And as a result, I was starting to become a much more confident artist. So, if you are still pretty new to working with underpaintings, here's a couple practical tips that might help you. One of my favorite ones is basically to work with the largest brush possible, even if it feels uncomfortable. The reason why I love doing this is because, yes, it allows you to actually paint more quickly because you're covering more surface area, but working with really large brushes in your underpainting actually prevent you from jumping into details too early. Another thing is focusing on values and building up that 3D form, like I mentioned earlier. Color and detail, these should not be in your brain right now. You can bake a little bit of color into your underpainting, but through the magic of glazing, I know that color is going to be so much easier if I worry about it down the road. The second habit I started doing in my artwork is to bake in a little bit of chaos in those details. Honestly, one of the biggest mistakes I made with my wildlife and pet art for years was the fur was too perfect. And I know this is one of those things where it feels a bit goofy to say that you should be including a bit of chaos in your art. But the thing is that it's going to make it more believable. Realistic doesn't necessarily mean clean and tidy. Think about nature. there's chaos, there's randomness. Even if you look at your dog or your cat, unless you just freshly brushed them, their fur is going to be a little bit messy. It's just the nature of nature at the end of the day. And the thing is that when we aren't trying to capture that chaos, things are going to look too perfect and it's going to look wrong. Your audience might not be able to look at your art and say, oh, the fur is, too perfect and therefore it is wrong. But they're going to know there's going to be some sort of like subconscious thought that is in their heart when they're looking at your artwork, and it's just going to feel a little off. So rather than, having your fur look too perfect, I invite you to add a little bit of chaos. So when I was starting to paint Cora's face here, I knew that I wanted that super soft, fluffy corgi fur, and I wanted it to look real, not like it was basically kind of plastic or perfect toy. So what I do is I like to add what I call rogue hairs. And basically these are just hairs that I am painting in that are a little rogue. They're going in a different direction than the rest of them. They're kind of crossing over the rest of the hairs underneath. Some of them have a little bit more texture. Sometimes I add little wiggles to my brushstroke just to add some variation. All of this is going to make a huge difference to make your fur look more realistic. So if you're, thinking to yourself, okay, maybe I do need to invite a little bit more chaos into my artwork, here's a couple tips that might help. One of the things is take a physical step back from your artwork. You might be able to actually pinpoint some areas that just look a little too neat, and then go ahead and add a little bit of chaos. A little means a lot here, so you definitely don't have to go overboard, but a couple well-placed brushstrokes can make a huge difference. Another thing is to vary your brush pressure and direction. Actually, do some brushstrokes that are going to be crossing over the rest of them. Do some that have a little wiggle to them. It's just little touches that you can add that are going to make a big difference. The third habit is to leave parts of the painting less finished on purpose. I love doing this, arguably sometimes too much, but in my opinion, not every square inch of your painting needs that hyper sharp detail. In fact, I find that when everything is equally detailed, the viewer's eye just doesn't really know where to look. It can feel a little too busy, a little too overwhelming. And instead, what we want to try and do is be conscious of what we want our viewers to look at first. So when it comes to painting portraits of animals, like my dog here, typically the most important parts are going to be the eyes and the center of the face. So we as humans, it is our instinct to look at the face and specifically the eyes of living things. It's just how we connect. So that's probably where your viewer is going to be looking first. So that's where I would pack the most detail. And then anything that's kind of moving away from that, you can start to add less and less detail. You can even go so far as to blend out your brushstrokes so that they are softer and more blurred. And this is really going to help to pull the focus to those main focal points, which in this point here is going to be the eyes, the center of the face. I like to use looser brush strokes as I'm moving away from those areas. And then if I'm still having things look a little too sharp, I like to go ahead and softly blend things out. So it kind of fades out into the background a little bit. And I find that this works especially well for pet portraits because it's going to just bring the attention to their face, which, especially for pets, and you're painting, someone's pet, you know what they look like. And that face is something that you are going to be very, very familiar with. So that's what you want the focus to be on. So in this particular portrait of Cora here, I'm focusing my sharpest detail on the eyes and her muzzle and her nose. And then I'm letting the rest of the fur get more soft and sort of suggestive. And it's going to bring the focus to her cute little foxy face. The fourth habit is going to be to use glazes to fix, not just finish. Now, if you've watched any of my videos, you know that glazing is my favorite technique ever. It's just, I love it. It's so helpful. It's just the closest I can get to a magic trick as an artist. And glazing isn't just for that final sparkle, it's a huge problem solver throughout the painting process. There's so many great ways that you can use glazes. And in case you're wondering, Danny, what on earth is a glaze? A glaze is basically a thin wash of color that you are applying to a perfectly dry painting in order to add some subtle color shifts. So I love to use an oil painting medium and add a little bit of transparent paint and brush that onto my painting to add these subtle color shifts. And there are so many amazing ways that you can use it. So, for instance, let's say your entire painting is too light in color and you don't have deep shadows, and therefore your animal is feeling really flat. It almost kind of looks like a sticker cutout rather than a 3D animal. Glazes to the rescue. You can mix up what I like to call a shadow glaze, which typically is going to be a very dark glaze that I put a little bit of color in just to add some richness and some life to it. And then I'm using that in the shadows to deepen those shadows, which is going to emphasize that 3D form without obscuring any of your hard work below. So let's say that you've painted a beautiful section of fur, gorgeous detail, gorgeous texture, but it's too light and it's making your animal look very flat. Let that detail dry completely and then do a shadow glaze on top. And then, beautiful. You now have a lot more of that 3D look to it. You can also use glazes to be able to fix colors. So this can be to add colors to your painting. So, if you're working on your underpainting, I like to say that color is going to be coming later. Well, now is later, and that's where you can use glazes to really like brighten that color, add that saturation. But it's not just for that as well. You can use it to add more life to your portraits here. One of my favorite ways to do it is to kind of bring the focus to the main focus of our painting here by using cooler glazes around the sort of periphery of the animal. And what this is going to do is it's basically going to trick your brain into thinking that it is further away. So little things like this where you can use these color shifts and different temperatures of colors to add so much life and just overall a 3D sort of image that you're creating here, even if it's just on a flat surface. The fifth habit is to start with big brushes and then wait to earn the small ones. And we kind of talked about this a little bit when we were talking about underpaintings, but I like to keep this sort of habit or a rule throughout my paintings because it makes a big difference. A lot of self-taught artists, my hand is up, I am definitely part of this crew. We tend to start too small too early. And ultimately, it's really going to slow down your painting and it's going to weaken your foundation. And hands up if you've ever spent hours upon hours in detail, completely sucked in to your painting, losing track of time. And then you take a step back and you're like, oh, that looks bad. And then you end up having to repaint that area. That is so heartbreaking because it's so much lost effort and time. But when you actually take a breath and make sure you're working with larger brushes before you move to smaller brushes, you can actually avoid that heartache altogether. So that's why I like to say, try to complete your underpainting with your largest brushes possible and only moving to smaller brushes when it just becomes impossible to get it done with those larger brushes. And then, even once you move into your detail paths, I like to still work with larger brushes first as I'm building up that final, sort of first detail pass. And then as I'm moving through my lighter colors, especially if I'm starting to move into areas that I want to be more in focus, the center of the face, only then do I start to move into my smaller brushes. Because that is going to force you to just make better decisions and not get completely sucked into detail prematurely. So this habit, it ultimately trains you on how to focus on values and shape and flow first. and then it's going to make your detail work way easier and faster later on. So I hope these habits are going to give you some new ideas of what to try in your next painting. Honestly, even just applying one or two of these makes a huge difference in how confident I felt when painting pets like little Miss Cora here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.